Good afternoon, everybody, and hello to our training session. This is the HUD series on understanding public housing and occupancy, in particular called Putting It All Together. Why do I say that in the title? Because this is the last webinar in this series, which this is number 8. And I'm so happy to have you here and go through the material. Some of the items are literally snippets of previous webinars as reminders on building up the conversation. If you did not have a chance to participate in webinar 1 through 7, no worries, you still get a good amount of information, and I will be referencing back to previous webinars that you can obtain far more information and detail, as this is essentially summarizing the whole series together. And with that, next slide, please. All right, so this is learning objectives and introduction. We have the IEM team here, Krista, that is helping in the background, myself, Siglinde Chambliss, presenting this particular webinar today. It is an interactive webinar, as interactive as you want it to have. In this particular one, we won't have polls, but you have opportunity to share experience and ask questions. And then our learning objective for this particular session today will be understanding how the occupancy information impacts an authority. So we'll be revisiting 2021-35 from PIC. Participants will learn practical strategies on how to use the physical needs assessment to support optimal occupancy. Very important as part of repositioning. And participants will recognize how to maintain optimal occupancy and streamline the unit turn, which can be a challenge these days. Next slide, please. All right, few housekeeping items that we have to talk about. In this webinar, you are muted, but if you want to speak, you have raising the hand feature. Please make yourself familiar with the screen. On my screen, I see a hand on the bottom of my screen towards the middle. And you can also, in your chat, say, hey, I would like to speak and I can't figure it out. Can you unmute me? So let us know. You can also use your feature that's called Q&A. Again, orient yourself on the screen. You should see on the bottom, most likely, the little bubble that says chat. And next to it, if you don't see Q&A, there are 3 little dots. And you click on that, and it will open up Q&A and notes, so we can respond to your questions immediately. And then, of course, this particular webinar, as all the other webinars, will be posted on the HUD Exchange at a later date. And I think we have confirmed that 6 webinars have already been posted up or in the process to be completed, posted up. But many of them, the first series, are already available for you on the HUD Exchange. When you type in the search occupancy, this should pop up. All right, with that, we're going to next slide. We are starting our occupancy impact discussion. Next slide, please. All right, so we have talked about really in detail and in-depth webinar 1 about IMS PIC in particular, because any information that is not in PIC is not visible to HUD. And all of you should have received already reminders from HUD that certification is necessary for the capital fund. And again, it drives or is driven from data points in PIC, because you have to identify the kind of status that the unit is in. And if it's not there, it would not be eligible for capital funds. And if the unit is there, not in disposition, based on your occupancy percentages and so forth, the formula is calculated on the funding that you will receive for capital funds. So it's all correlated, and that deadline actually occurs mid-August. So you should have that. If you don't have that email and need to be concerned about who does this validation and activity in your housing authority, ask. And make sure that your inventory is correct, because again, the first of a drawer is making sure our data is organized, our inventory is correct, all your addresses, your buildings, the status of the units. Of course, the next item is the timely reporting of it, you should do this activity. Really, it's part of a daily function because you have move-ins and move-outs on a daily basis, but you may want to really focus on a monthly basis to always reconcile and ensure your PIC data is accurate and do your update categories, your funding, and so you want to be aware. But again, we had a very extensive webinar on this particular topic to go through, so please feel free to go back to earlier sessions. Next slide, please. The highlight of the 2021-35, again, what is PIC4 occupancy? It shows your detail on developments, your building structures, your units, unit floor numbers, sometimes even door numbers, the type of units, unit designations, and unit sizes. It is updated when tenant information changes. So anybody who has that function to enter the data in your software that speaks or can connect to the HUD software piece will occur. Then you have, of course, occupancy percentage that's calculated that is used also in your scoring, and on a routine basis you may receive emails from local HUD office that tells you, hey, what are you doing with this low occupancy? So that's where that stuff is coming from. Then HUD also has a dashboard. You can use this dashboard. You can go on to HUD.gov, look for the public housing dashboard, and you can measure yourself against other housing authorities in your jurisdiction on occupancy, because the data that all housing authorities are reporting are available through the dashboard feature. It uses a Power BI tool, so take a look at it. It is also used to, the data points are used to bring in and import when you submit your annual submissions for your operating subsidy, which is done on the 52723. That's coupled with the 722 for the utility that you do, and you all have worked through the new way of doing it through the web design, and very well done. But that's how the data speaks and populates the form based on your input. And then, of course, it's used for, as I've stated, capital fund calculation based on the inventory. There's a note on there. When you receive these PowerPoint slides in HUD Exchange and you see text that is underlined in blue, it is an active hyperlink. So once you have access to that, you actually will be able to click on that and it will open up the resource for you to do additional reading on it. Next slide, please. The PIH Notice 2021-35, which we also covered, is talking about, just as a reminder, your 4 main categories that you have available and your subcategories that you determine and decide which status the units are going under that you need to change. And it, of course, it has a process, an approval process, and you work that with your local HUD office. I think everybody has that under their belt on how to do that. And if you have questions, there's definitely your local HUD office is your first resource. And then when you go on the PIC on the HUD.gov, you have additional reading materials and a very, very detailed step-by-step pamphlet, you can say, instruction book to help you navigate through that. And then, of course, you got your SNE, your super user that can always help you through those particular activities and get those unit status changes done in PIC. Next slide, please. All right, special instructions. On your student's unit status, you make sure that you meet the requirements as HUD defines, that you have the right subcategories. As I said, there is an approval process. It is tied to the 505(8) submission that you do for the tenant, and you have a special instructions section in the notice on how to process with demolition disposition status activity. So I say activity because it could be just partial or full, but there are specific instructions in that notice. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to uncover scoring. In particular, we will talk about the physical inspection assessment subsystem that you know by PAS, the management assessment subsystem scoring, which is MAS, and then how Capital Fund Program CFP is also affected with the scoring tool. Next slide. All right, so the purpose of this physical inspection assessment subsystem is whether you have decent, safe, sanitary, and good repair units to house individuals. And of course, everything has to conform to the UPCS, insured for Uniform Physical Condition Standards. And you have inspections that are being performed by the HUD team, REACT team, we call them, and they come out and do a HUD inspection, in short. And the primary use is still using independent inspectors that come out, and it's transforming through Inspire. We're not going into in depth here, but there is essentially something that somebody does to assess whether the unit is safe and sanitary, decent to house. All that information is compiled to a project score that runs up to a composite score for the housing authority, because you may have only one property or AMP, or you may have 10 or 20 AMPs. So each AMP is scored separately to come up with a composite score. The 5 areas scored: sites and common areas. Sites usually have large deducts in points, be aware. Building systems and building exteriors, so major systems, and of course anything visible on the outside. Unit as applicable, and just know that anything that goes into health and safety scoring elements, you always want to make sure that you address those, because those are the highest deducts. Next slide, please. So the importance of HUD scoring, pass, and REACT inspection, which are correlated, are based on documenting your deficiencies, and many of them, of course, do it electronically now. The physical condition factors have a weight, have a score that feed into your public housing assessment FOSS score overall. Your UPCS inspections follows a set schedule based on your performance for the housing authority in general. High performers, every 3 years, your inspector comes back out. So the incentive is to score high. So you see HUD inspectors come out less. Between 80 and 90 out of 100, they would come every 2 years. And if you are deemed a troubled agency because you scored below that, you have annual inspections that you can anticipate. Why is this important? The physical condition score or indicator, the way you calculate it, in the overall 100 points, 40 points are for the physical conditions of the property. You must pass with 24 points. And with that said, 60%, 24 points out of 40, must be met to pass this particular condition. Become familiar with the scoring and the impact of the scoring, and know that you may pass overall, but you must always pass your sub-indicators. All right, how can we maximize the score? Well, what we can do to help our team at the housing authority level, the maintenance team and the management team, we can always, of course, review the inspection report, and they are usually very quickly available as far as your scoring elements, where they came out and what points they achieved, so you will know fairly quickly. You will always have site and exterior common areas in general are worth 15 points each, and the building systems are worth 20, and the units have slightly higher, but they come out to be 35 points. So if you have unit deficiencies, they have a higher ding on that score, but right there on these elements, that's 35 out of 40. So then also you want to be aware that they make differentiation between severe, major, and minor deficiencies, and of course, health and safety. So health and safety uses A, B, and C to differentiate, where A means no health and safety, B means non-life-threatening, and C means life-threatening. When you get these reports and you have health and safety, you are actually required to take care of those immediately within the 24 hours, because obviously it is not safe to maintain in that unit. What are the typical categories for health and safety? Exigent, which is essentially your air quality, coming back to propane, natural gas, methane gas, electrical hazards, hot water heater, HVAC. So those are examples. Fire safety, emergency equipment, fire exits, fire escapes, and of course, smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors most likely will be updated here, but all part of fire, not necessarily fire safety for carbon, but also for air quality. Non-life threatening are your elevator hazards, infestation, garbage and debris, air quality from sewer odor. So on the elevator hazard, you're supposed to have annual elevator inspections done. Make sure your inspection certificates are always visible. Don't lose points on that. Always make sure tenants on what they can do to help overall health of the property and keep infestation down, which can make children and people sick. And garbage and debris, if that's an issue, sometimes community meetings can help, but it is a focus because it's just leading to another issue, such as infestation and, of course, quality of air when all that smell, the odors are around. So these are just some somewhat helpful tips, an accumulation, a summary of what we had discussed in previous webinars. Complying with the UPCS. So again, you want to focus and make sure that you have a well-designed routine inspection plan. You can use these particular information results and refine your routine maintenance plan, incorporate them if you know that's an issue. And then that way it becomes a daily routine, monthly routine, quarterly routine, annual routine for your staff. And you don't have to worry about that because you have it on the list. You make sure somehow you have access to a unit, not just upon turnover. This is staying connected. You can use your pest control and tell you, hey, there's a unit over there that I entered and we have issues with hoarding or more stuff compiled. You may want to look at that. Keep your open communication channels with your vendors and have them communicate to you. So you might be able to connect them to some services, because as tenants age out, they may not be able to clean the unit as they wanted to, but they have a high desire, and you can help with that. So have a reason to go into the unit. Anytime you go in and have work orders, have the maintenance person catalog the condition on the work order as far as inside health of a unit. Walk your property. We talk about curb appeal in one of the webinars, and make it welcome and make it inviting that people want to stay and take care of the community. Walk it, record what you see, train your maintenance staff, your property staff, assistant property staff on how to see what is happening to create work orders and jump on it immediately to get it fixed for you. As I said, connection with contractors when they go out and they manage a work order that you're not managing in-house, that you have to contract out, or you have an annual maintenance agreement for those services. Have a rapport with them, have them report to you what they see, have a dialogue, open communication. Of course, because health and safety have the largest point deductions, be aware of those areas, focus on them so you're always prepared. And then really prioritize your defects based on your point losses, because the highest point deduct obviously has the higher priority, and then get to the other items immediately after that. On the inspections and documentation, in the old days, I say old days, it's not even that far removed, 20, 25 years, 15 years, we were used to carrying binders and had that stuff accumulated in binders. If you're still there and you haven't done yet, create virtual records so you have those handy for you and anybody else that needs to access them on a network, and it's easy for everybody to just get to and to share information as shared information resources so they can add to the procedure or add to the documentation. So it's just a recommendation on how we evolve regarding those type of inspections. Next slide, please.
Hi, Sig. I just also wanted to insert here. I know this is sort of a webinar where we're pulling together a number of previous trainings we've conducted, but just on that previous slide and a few of the other previous ones, we talk about UPCS, but just wanted to make sure folks are aware that, Inspire has replaced that. And so, while in some cases the content is probably, still applicable here, the language has changed. So I just wanted to note that here as well.
Correct. Thank you, Helena, because Inspire is just going full force and those updates weren't done yet. On mass scoring, the calculation is essentially focused on occupancy. And as we said before, wrong PIC data also leads to wrong operating subsidy and a wrong mass occupancy rate. And how is that rate calculated? It is units leased from units available. So if you have 600 public housing units and only 500 are occupied, you will take away your uninhabitable and add in the special use and demolition properties, but that essentially will give you your occupancy score. I know this is very highlighted. We had the webinar on it in detail. The PIH Notice shows you that in the other previous HUD exchange training seminars. This is a function as part of your financial data schedule when you produce it for the whole year to know your score, but you can do this easily on a monthly basis. And when you maintain a 98% or more on your financial data schedule, when you actually submit the data and have that information on there, when you know you're over 98%, you already know that you can achieve the percentage range. So 98% would give you 12 points, the maximum points for occupancy out of that particular component. And no action is required on the housing authority's part. But if you're coming out 8 to 12 points, you will require improvement because you will be less than the 97, 96, or probably around 95%. And if you have 4 or fewer points, that will be problematic for HUD and the housing authority because you will be subsequently put on monitoring, more reporting, more discussion on what you're going to do to achieve higher occupancy rates.
Hey, Sig, I'm just going to jump in here with a question we have in the chat.
Yeah.
There's an individual asking how uninhabitable is determined, if there's some specific guidance around that.
I can't verbatim recite the information, but the PIH Notice 2021-35 has a description on what it means to be uninhabitable. And if it definitely doesn't pass scoring, then it's not habitable. So there's most likely a lot of pieces that go wrong. Your systems don't function, you don't have cabinets, you don't have the basics. So there's a lot of things. If you don't want to put your grandmother there and your mother in the unit, it's probably not habitable. I mean, that's like when you look at it that way. But systems functions, you don't have the basics, you don't have water, electricity, all of those pieces feed into it to be uninhabitable. So you got to have utility, you have to have your appliances, you have to have your systems working, health and safety taken care of, electrical, plumbing, all these pieces have to function. Now, the condition of that, it may be falling apart and you have to replace cabinets, but at least you got cabinets. So read that particular definition on uninhabitable in that category when you need to have a major contractor to fix the unit. And of course, any disaster, if you got mold and something in there, you can't put somebody in there. You have to cure and you have to clean up and harden. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay, awesome, no problem. Breakdown of mass scoring. So it has 3 elements. The occupancy rate, so depending on your scoring, is 16 points. That's the weight in the mass scoring, the management score. Tenant accounts receivable maximum score is 5 points. Be aware your financial data schedule is now reverting back to the old scoring, the data that you provide. So we had a little reprieve on the COVID, where many of you said, oh my God, I had a really good score right there. Well, that all went right back to the original scoring. So it's now 5 points again. And then high accounts payables, carrying high liabilities, of course, yields you no points. And so low accounts payables are rewarded and you get 4 points. All that together makes the mass score of 25 points. The threshold here to meet is 15 points in management. So you got 25 and 15 if you need to meet the threshold. And you're right there between the pass and the mass at 40 out of 100. So I just want to highlight that so you get a feel for that, because there's a financial score and the CFP score. Next slide, please. All right. So in CFP, the maximum points in the metric are 10, and there are two different matrices met. One is for timely obligation, and you all know that have CFP funds. You get 2 years to obligate, 2 years to expend. Of course, during COVID, we had some extensions. And just as a reminder, if you are one of those housing authorities that can move funds for 1410 or are doing that and use 1406 for operations, those are immediately obligated at the time of drawdown in the letter of credit control system, LOCKS in short. And you know, in order to achieve 5 points, you must have 90% obligated by the obligation end date. So those are your first 5 points. The next 5 points are based on occupancy, and that's why the PIC data has to be accurate for August 15 as well, because here the threshold is if you're occupied greater than 96%, you get all 5 points. So we talked about the thresholds from pass and mass. If you just do the minimum, there will be 25 and 15, that's 40. If you get all 10 from CFP, that's 50. And then there's the financial score. So you see how that builds up. So we have to do better on pass and mass and cannot rely on just financial score and CFP score. And you see the scale for CFP, how it dwindles down. When you have less than 93% occupancy, you get no score. So you lose all your points, but at least you get 2 points when you're between 96 and 93. But again, if you're one of those housing authorities that really has to scramble because of pass and mass, it is important to also have these particular points for you in that scoring scheme. Next slide, please. Maximizing your scores. Again, highlighting that we must have good data in PIC. So data scrubbing, very important. You must record it timely, accurately, referring back to your PIH notice that has updated language. This notice is well written, has a lot of good information, and also links the information right back to your federal citation where there is additional reading. If in doubt, always work with your local HUD office to get a better interpretation. And I say get it in writing, because that way at least you know what you ask and the response that you received. Turn your vacant units quickly, so unit turnover, focus on that and monitor your vacancies. We know that we have issues potentially with the market and have vacancy loss due to certain aspects, which we covered in other webinars and talked about it extensively, where you have undesirable jobs, locations to live in, not satisfactory for the resident. They don't want to be there. School system, transportation system, all kinds of different issues. So just monitor that for the reasons why your tenants are moving out or away, and scrubbing and maintaining an updated wait list. You know, this is usually part of an easy finding for an auditor when they come in and do your compliance testing and say, okay, just give me the process and how do you maintain your wait list. So make sure you follow your processes and procedures and purge frequently and often. And then, of course, anything you find in management that you see as a pain point, go after the root issue, identify it, have a team meeting, go over it and see what you can do to help improve occupancy and turn units quickly. Next slide, please.
Hey, Sig, we have a question from a few slides back.
Yep.
I apologize.
Perfect. No, perfect.
Someone was asking if you could talk a little bit about how AP is calculated.
Accounts payables. So accounts payable, yes. So it looks at how much cash you have, assets, and how high is the liability against the assets. So the lower the liability to pay out from the cash that you have, your assets, the higher the score. I give you a practical tip, which we have done in the previous webinar. We have highlighted that how to control that. The recommendation that I have is make sure you always capture your AP, of course, timely. Make sure you have a routine accounts payables process to remove the liabilities off the books, the balance sheet. But prior to fiscal year close, do another check run. Get as much paid as possible. If you're one of those that pulls in 1410, the cash from capital fund, bring that cash in towards the end of the fiscal year instead of the beginning of the fiscal year when you know you don't necessarily need it. You need it for your budget, but you don't need to bring it in every month. You can bring it in, the cash, towards the end of the fiscal year. That way you are improving your cash position because your new operating subsidy for the new fiscal year is not available until the 1st or 2nd of the new month, the new FY. So it's important that you also show high cash at the end of the fiscal year. So you need to balance your accounts payables transactions and literally get them paid out off the books prior to year end. The second strategy that you do to improve your AP is, or your cash position per se, and AP, of course, anything related to capital projects, pay the project and draw the money down prior to year end. The money has to hit your books prior to fiscal year end. If your fiscal year end is March 31st, you draw the money down 3-4 days prior to make sure it's in your bank account, not hidden over a weekend or a holiday. So you do that with every fiscal year. You ask staff, get that stuff together. Let's do a preliminary drawdown mid of the month because you know you already got your expenses posted through the AP cycle. Draw that money down if CFP, and then at when the last payment cycle occurs for that fiscal year, whatever bills you got on there, draw that money down. That way you are replenishing your cash. Your AP is low, but your cash is high. So those are the best practical experiences that I can give you to manage your cash and your liabilities. Did that answer that?
That was great. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. So with that said, before we move on, any additional questions? If not, we are looking to the impact to PHAs. Next slide, please. All right, occupancy. So this is again the occupancy series. So we're talking about a lot about occupancy and best practices. We already said low scores affect funding. So that's not a fun thing to balance. Low funding does not provide the necessary resources because everybody will say, I have to do this and I have to do that. And then you go to fiscal or your manager and they say, well, there's no money. So there's cause and effect. What I'm trying to say here is cause and effect, and they're interrelated, and we have to tackle the problem together. It is not a fiscal problem alone, and it's not a program problem alone. It's a together team issue that has to get fixed. Without the resources, of course, you have difficult time to turn the units and meeting the timelines. So you have to look and evaluate your resources that you have. Do you have reserves, operating reserves? Do you have the contractors? Do you have your procurement done and you don't have to worry about it because you have an agreement in place for the next 5 years? You know,
excuse me, Sig, I think you cut out a little bit. Could you just repeat what you just said?
Burden, but there's a due diligence that you can do to overcome this. Wrong data in PIC leads to bad funding, not the right amount. And of course, it affects your score. So that's just in a nutshell. But again, here's very summarized, high level, which we discussed in previous webinars. I heard some noise in the background. Were we okay? Was there a question?
I see. You had cut out a little bit right in the beginning when you were mentioning this slide.
Oh, okay. Well, the highlight of here is low scores always affect funding, and the difficulty is when you have no funding, it is hard to balance your operations and your business. And I was highlighting that it's not just a fiscal problem, it's also an issue with the program. Together as a team, you can come to problem solving, how to overcome and look at all the resources that you have available, including reserves, and potentially reshuffling your capital fund program to make sure that you get those pieces delivered, including how you do your procurement and have certain agreements in place that provide you greater stability to actually be able to do the activity if your maintenance staff is overwhelmed and can't do it all themselves. That's kind of the highlight. Next slide, please. All right, we have best practices, how to optimize occupancy for you. Next slide. All right, so the best thing you can do, what we believe is, of course, understanding your inventory. And the way you do that is with the physical needs assessment. Your routine maintenance plan should not be a surprise to you to know that you have major systems expiring and they need replacement. So you can use the other tool, physical needs assessment, to get your whole inventory information and know where you stand. I say this also, this is very important when it comes to making a decision in management on asset repositioning or how to obtain financial resources to finance major improvements. So you want to have this kind of data form, whichever way you can get it, and know your schedule and cost for replacing major items. The PHA also helps us to lay the foundation as asset also what's called real estate management function. And sometimes you have, if you're a larger agency, you have a separate office and you're not really coming together and talk about it. But again, once this is achieved, bringing the team together to say, this is what we learned, it would take all these resources. What together as a team can we do to overcome? Do we need a different plan? Of course, with knowing your physical needs assessment activity, you know how much money you will need, how distressed and aged the properties are, not just through the visual, but a confirmation for an investor to support and also HUD to show what is needed to get this actually in a, occupiable stage, I would want to say. Next slide. When is it required? You absolutely must have it when you go through RAD conversion. So it's then has a different name where you go through the PNA. It achieves the same thing. CPNA, it achieves the same to know the physical condition. Why is it needed? Because anytime you do RAD conversion, a reserve is established similar to when you go through LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit transformation. When we call under the old HOPE 6s, we were seeking funding from tax credit investors, and the investors require replacement reserve so you can fund those activities. So this actually helps establish the deposits to be made and how much the replacement reserve needs to have an upfront funding to even go through the conversion process to make sure you have the financial resources to maintain the property. And then anytime you do any loans with the HUD program that includes the HUD 221D 4 program, the refinance program when you purchase an apartment building, the 223F, and then of course any refinancing for multifamily on the 223A and 7. These are short acronyms. Once you type these into your Google browser, all your literature related to that pops up. Next slide. PHA and asset repositioning. So we have said it shows you the results what you need in terms of cash. It determines or helps you to determine what your financial gap may be if you are doing asset repositioning for yourself, or you try to determine how could you fund a $20 million project. What do I need to do? Is the tax credit out there? Do I want to go down that path? What kind of loans does HUD offer? Things like that. Determine your gap, resources that you do not have readily available at your authority. It, of course, helps also to revise and tweak your routine maintenance plan because you know where your deficiencies are for sure. And if you know you need to replace HVAC, you make sure you have a good preventative maintenance program first for HVAC and don't just let them deteriorate, but then you also put them on a cycle for replacing them because face it, most of the time we don't have the resources to do all at once. We have to piecemeal it and do every year a few, but eventually you get it done. And then of course you look at that information, help cross-train your staff, know what items you're looking for, but all these are very good practical things and tips that come out of performing a physical assessment for the property. Next slide, please. Additional information, how it's being used. Again, you will know what a PNA is very good in detail. It tells you whether there is compliance matters that conform to ADA and 504. Those have to be done first, but it also will tell you what short-term life expectancy, what's a immediate short-term or long-term effect. Maybe your roof become immediate and your long-term is your plumbing. So the report will give you that information. It can also, of course, help you with estimating the repair cost because it does take current values into consideration to calculate how much it will cost, because I just said it is used to calculate how much deposit need to occur into the replacement reserve, and then it identifies how immediate or the time length that it needs to be specified, that it needs to be set up. Is it the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? So it's very detailed. It helps you to plan. Next slide, please. I'm going to pause here before we continue with additional optimized occupancy. Any question? There was a whole webinar on physical needs assessment and the use of it and how you gain information out of it to the best use for your staff, your organization. All right, next slide, please.
Nothing here in the chat or Q&A at the moment.
Awesome, thank you. Causes for vacancies. So when we want to talk about optimization, we need to understand cause. We have routine unit turns. Does somebody capture their data? Does somebody look at that? There's move-ins and move-outs. Maybe you can compile data points and you can determine a monthly average. When you have your monthly average, you know what you need to work on. You know what supplies you may need. You know you can't send all maintenance staff on vacation, and you have to phase and stack things. So what is your routine number? What is that percentage? We have talked about sometimes tenants don't want to stay there any longer, or maybe it's a 3-story building. It does not have an elevator, and now they have mobility issues. You don't have something readily available for them to move on the ground floor, and to just moving away into a different community that does have elevators for a 2-story building. So we are competing with what else is out there in the market. Sometimes it's just the age and condition. Job loss we talked about. Location, not just for jobs, but also think of children. When children have needs to have after-school program, daycare, doctors, hospitals, transportation, all of those weigh into decision factors. Of course, being impacted by potential damage from disasters that I've listed here on the bottom, any RAD conversion you may undertake, or Hope 6 transformed into CNI, we now say Choice Neighborhood Initiatives. That, of course, puts a huge burden on an authority having to vacate a lot of units to do the new development. And then, of course, any deferred maintenance. So we talked about if you have a well-designed preventative maintenance plan, you should not really have deferred maintenance unless you really lack resources and funding. And if you're not collecting rent and help supplement operating subsidy, there's one of the bleeds that occurs on the public housing side for not having potential resources. So we also have to look to rent collection. Next slide, please. Challenges, there's 4 major groupings. External challenges that we talked about that can derive from the labor market, your local government, board, your partners, financial, of course, we talked about that. And on the financial side, it's also resources and supply. Supply is still low and is high in price. So we have to put more money out to get less. And sometimes our processes that we have in place hinder us to be effective and efficient. And sometimes we are unable to attract and retain the staff that we need, which can cost us in the long run. Sometimes paying just a little bit more is enough to overcome the financial impact of that higher wage, because the gain is everything else that you get out of that by just having that qualification in the staff to do those activities. Administratively, we talked about waitlist issues, not alone, but also integration of technology, how to do things faster, quicker, more efficient, not needing to have a person to file documents. So less paper creates faster processes so you can focus on something else. So think about on integration. What is I have seen it in many authorities. There's a great software package and only less than 50% of that software package is used because nobody wants to take the time at implementation to ensure all modules are being fully flushed out and developed with procedures and staff trained how to integrate. Oh, I do that later. This is important to do this first. And then once you pass that phase where you're doing, you never go back and really use it to the fullest capacity the way it was intended. But guess what? You're paying for it. So take a look at that, where you have that bleed, your low-hanging fruits, and optimize your use of technology. And then, of course, on the operational level, when you have those lack of resources or lack of income coming in from not enough operating subsidy, not enough rents, that's hard to overcome. The supplement is, what do I have to do to dip into the reserves and get capital funds? HUD also has many different type of grants that they always push out and identify to say, hey, put a grant application in for that. So don't shy away from those opportunities. Next slide, please. When you are in a rural area, we addressed this in the previous webinars as well. A definition is essentially adversely affected by extraordinary economic events. What are those? They are, the area is impacted by disaster. There is lack of affordable housing. Usually high-speed internet is one of those factors as well. Schools, jobs, high-paying jobs, suppressed wages based on the area that you are. And that even happens in California as well. And lack access of credit, being able to go to the bank and actually be able to receive a loan, having lack access to credit, to be able to get resources. So when those systems aren't in place in rural areas, it makes it difficult to overcome And that creates different challenges to an authority on what it may need to do going forward. But it is there, it is out there. I've seen it and cut off, and no matter what you try to do, you will not be able to achieve the desired occupancy percentages that you want. Next. We talked about, in particular in the webinar, in the previous webinars, and this is highlighted here, what are some of those examples which I have mentioned. I talked about the school, an industry. You can lose a whole industry in your area, and the factory, the plant that gives everybody jobs is gone the next day because, I don't know, whatever, they no longer have a tax credit benefit to be in that location. We talked about transportation. Ask your staff how they get to work when you're in a rural area. That gives you a good signal. The job opportunities that are there. Of course, we talked about disaster. We talked about opportunity zones. If your opportunity zones, certain investors will not even look at your area to lend you the funds to do what you need to do. But the last piece that I save here is supplies, because again, if you're in an area where it's hard to get to and your largest Walmart, HD Supply, Home Depot, which is separate from HD Supply, or Lowe's, if they are not close to you, you as a housing authority have a challenge to get access to supplies. You may develop a special relationship then with your local vendors. There could be an Ace hardware store or whatever, to just make sure that you have the important materials that you need, including paint. So of course we don't want inventory, but sometimes we have to do what we have to do given in the area that you are. Be mindful, but supplies is still an issue, including vendors in your area that may want to visit you and actually do that job. Next slide. So what are those best practices to overcome? This in particular is a combination. So it's addressing also, of course, disaster, but these are just a few recommendations. When you're stricken by disaster and you have to rebuild, then most likely, and not always, I say this, sometimes, but not always, do you have a presidentially declared disaster and have access to FEMA, city, state, and county funds, insurance proceeds, and then disaster mitigation funds for hardening. FEMA also has a mitigation and hardening program where they are willing to give you a little bit more money for approved projects to improve the project up to 15% through the mitigation dollars that they have available. But there are separate CDBG, DR, and MIT mitigation grants out there that you can get access to say, I'm not going to rebuild the roof the way I did before. I'm going to have it sustain wind of 180 miles instead of 150 miles. So there are dollars out there to help you identify what you can do to strengthen your building, including storm improved windows, for example. Always work and know who is in your local community, your nonprofits, your banks. Banks are great partners. They have a philanthropy and development arm associated with them, and you can get a lot of participation by just finding out what your local bank can do and access your local partners. So identify them, who they are, seek them out, see what they can do. Many receive already funding to do things for your tenants and your employees, not just your tenants, like the credit, how they correlate, readily available in your local community. I'm thinking of Goodwill, Salvation Army, those major nonprofits. You can always, especially in the rural areas, there's a lot done through the transportation funding that is being put out there, and HUD has highlighted that to improve fiber and internet connectivity, but there's a lot of grants out there to improve fiber. So not just rural areas, and look for those resources. They are out there, and have somebody to file application to improve connectivity for your tenants and children in your house, in the households of your communities. And then, of course, on the transportation, it's a little harder, but if you have a career center, one-stop shop, they sometimes have also access or things that they do depending on who they connect with for your employers, and they might be willing to provide transportation pools. So check it out. And for your growth opportunities, if the schools are going away, the brick and mortar in your areas, look to online universities and your technical schools, you know, that are close in your area, your technical schools, to get access. How are we doing on time? It's almost 2:30. Which slide number are we on? Asset repositioning. Next slide, please. Slide 32. Okay, about 10 more slides. Let's see how we're doing here. About 10 more slides, and then we're done. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Asset repositioning, we had a webinar on that extensively as well, fully dedicated to that and the tools. So I'm only highlighting here. We are going to asset reposition because obviously we want to preserve affordable housing, and we want to replace our obsolete housing. And the benefit of going through asset reposition is to obtain relief from public housing regulation, and of course no longer have that kind of hot scoring that we have to undergo, and just have different freedom, I would say, from regulatory requirements. You can streamline your operation. You can be put on a stable platform for your funding with guaranteed annual increases. You can expand your housing, your Section 8 program, Housing Choice Voucher program, by just going to RAD PBV or PBRA. You can now determine if you want to self-manage your assets, and you become more attractive to investors now through the low-income housing tax credit program, and really can revive your property under those financing tools. Next slide, please. Impacts of asset repositioning, besides migrating, you know, it has to be budget neutral. So public housing OPSOP and capital fund go over to Section 8, that's budget neutral. Not having enough participating landlords can be a pitfall, because you're growing it on the Section 8 program and you're not having enough landlords that may want to participate. You may have, especially when you are able now to increase your project-based vouchers and you can't find somebody to put people in. You lack the access to a qualified management arm. So that sometimes will solve the answer to, do I self-manage or do I find somebody qualified out there? Sometimes you have no choice if you don't find somebody qualified out there. Then what happens subsequently in asset repositioning, you will lose the fee income from the public housing side. If you were a housing authority that had the fee-for-service model and drew a fee for bookkeeping, management, and asset fee, then, you know, those fees no longer come in to support your overhead. So you have to look at your overhead and how you are going to streamline that down to support your new organizational structure. Be aware that that goes away. So go through your financial calculation, calculate that out. And of course, if you are streamlining and you're repositioning and you're no longer managing your own properties, and the staff is not taken by the new management arm, and then you are contributing to job loss in that area. And hopefully there is opportunity, because the new management arm is not required to take your staff and work and maintain the properties for them. And of course, the big impact really is, why we're doing is to increase efficiency and streamline operations. So it's really a plus going through that particular process and being able to house or continue house for families that have that need for affordable housing. So we're maintaining that stock. Next slide, please. What do we need to ask? So am I ready to self-manage, or do I need to outsource? Sometimes also self-manage, especially with the light tax, you may most likely will have to have special approval that you are actually an approved operator in the state. Be aware of what it takes to do that and the process. Do my staff need to be trained up now? Are they ready to fill those positions? What can I do when I know I want to do this, which will take time, 2-3 years? Can I take that time to help train my staff and take all the necessary coursework to get them ready to do that? And then the wages and benefits, are you able to attract the necessary talent that now requires a different management approach and compliance? Are they able to do that? And are you able to actually get that in the job market? Maintenance may look a little different. Maintenance is really the same, but under the light tech model, or when you have an investor, they will be really looking for it. There is no more reprieve. There is like, why is this not done? Here's another report. Tell me about it. When do you fix it? So it may require a step up from your maintenance plan. And are your staff ready for that? You need to know your compliance requirements, because the more loans are on the property, the more investors and lenders you have speaking to you and require different compliance requirements to conform to. So be aware of that. Keep it simple. Sometimes you will require certification. Can you obtain that in your area? A lot is done online. So you have to make sure that you know exactly when your certifications expire to continue maintaining those certifications. Always know what your investors, lenders, and partnership agreements ask for. Make sure your systems are able to provide that. So check your software against the paperwork that's required in the reports and when they are required. And then, of course, are your forms, policies, and procedures conforming to the new requirements, and what is your timeline? The more time you have for planning, the better your results. That's all I can tell you, really. It's always coming down to the planning phase. I want to do this and I'm going to do that the next 6 months. You most likely will fail. It will not happen. You will cause a lot of stress and you may not be ready. So listen and look to your organization. Be aware of the timelines, how realistic those timelines are to achieve. There's a desire to do something and you may be hindered due to timeline for reality on what you really can do. Next slide. Benefits of closeout. So we have that in there as well, because sometimes we're just too small and it doesn't work and we have to close out or do asset reposition. So we always say that asset repositioning does provide property stabilization. We say that because we can say that we continue to provide affordable housing. We have a stable financial platform, so it's guaranteed money's coming in and has an inflation factor increase. We can leverage our opportunities. We can control our income streams. We can preserve now and look what the housing authorities' resources are that we might be able to preserve and bring over. We also may qualify for the DTTF funding and asset repositioning fee based on, which is for 3 years on a scaled version down, which is based on the type of asset repositioning tool that you choose. You can transfer your asset and liabilities to the newly created entity that you have. And please refer there to the 2014-24 PIH notice. Of course, you can now have local control and greater flexibility, and you have the administrative relief. So really, those in a nutshell are the major benefits associated with asset reposition. Next slide, please. Action plan. How do I get there? So 4 major items. You develop the strategy, you communicate, you have partners, and then you need the resources. Those are the four major elements. Develop the strategy. You must have all this information packed into your annual plan and admin plan. When you know you're going to do it and you put it in the annual plan, dust off your admin plan and make sure your language is consistent, because you have to have it over there as well when you choose your PBV or PBRA process. Communication, you usually, whatever internal communication you have before it gets out, your board needs to be aware. Your tenants need to be aware. So in RAD conversion is a very well organized process where you must have tenant meetings anyway, but have your partners at the table with your tenants and invite the board, have as much conversation around that topic to make it smooth and you're all on the same page. On the partner side, beside the local head office, on keeping progress, you need, of course, participating developers that you need to procure. You have a RAD resource team now available on the RAD resource desk. And then you need to evaluate all information at that time to have all of that available. So sometimes get knowledgeable first what it all takes. The RAD resource desk has all the information on there as well. And we did have an extensive coverage in a previous webinar around this. And of course, the final piece, without money, you can't make it work. So it only will convert and go to closing, financial closing, if you have the resources to finally start rehab work or rebuild. Next slide, please. Last section of maintaining optimal occupancy. Next slide. All right, so it's all about image and, of course, knowing what our tenants need. But it starts with the behavior, the perception of each property that we need to understand that we are a landlord. Just like Section 8 participating landlords that provide housing, we provide housing, we are landlords. We collect rents, we are landlords. We do that with a subsidized package, understood, but we are landlords. We should be focusing, looking at, would I want to live here? Is it appealing? What you can do to attract that curb appeal, to improve the look of your property. And then understanding, including your staff, all federal, state, and local requirements associated with operating that particular property. Know your move-ins and move-outs. Like I was saying, create those management reports if you're not focusing on that. Have conversation with your staff and have those timetables and decreasing the amount of unit turns and how long it takes to reoccupy a unit. Help with taking payments online. When you rent on your own and you compare that to a well-functioning apartment complex, many things are done online. A work order is not called in. It's most likely done online. And there is no reason why you as a housing authority cannot borrow for some of those practices and implement in your housing authority, just like the work orders. Be there promptly for the tenants. Don't have them call in 3 times, 4 times. When you know it's a problem, take care of the problem. That keeps frustration down and it improves your communication with your tenants. And then, of course, establishing this trust and rapport by keeping a robust tenant portal. Many of you during COVID have opted to now purchase a kiosk. That was a great opportunity to create those tenant portals. Continue flushing it out and do as much as you can on relieving mundane paperwork process and leave the communication channels open for the case manager to have a face-to-face conversation on what's really needed, when the rest can be done through a kiosk or online. And then, of course, help monitor the performance, the management performance of that property. Look at your reports. There's a lot of good software out there that tell you what is happening when you read the management reports that can help you pinpoint what those problem areas are for you. Next slide. We talked about, especially on the PIC tracking the right data, that also applies for anything else that you do, whether it's financial data, other programmatic data. Think about and look at all the reports. Are you really looking at them? Are they giving you the information that you need? Use your emerging technology to create the report that you want. If it's a customized report and it costs you a little bit of money to create it, do it. It's worthwhile in the long run when you have the data that you want to make good team decisions and management decisions. Don't be afraid to benchmark your performance just for the management team, for the staff, for the property. What are those benchmarks? Communicate them. Provide incentives if you can based off those benchmarks. We discussed that in the previous webinar as well, and questions arose for how much would be appropriate. So discuss those and see what's feasible. And then, of course, plan. The better you become in planning and proactively plan, the better your results. Sometimes we can also then forecast based on the new activity that we are planning. Is it realistic to achieve in timelines? And people will be less frustrated. Then, of course, when it's working for you, monitor it, do it, repeat it, because obviously it works. And then you have local hot office, you have hot dashboards, you have your peers, you have your neighboring housing authorities. The dashboard will help you show you who's in your area and establish those relationships and say, hey, what are you doing? Maybe there's something that is similar to my authority, because nothing is cookie cutter. Something on the West Coast may not work on the East Coast, vice versa. Something in your community may not work in the neighboring community. Different clientele, different transportation access, whatever. There are nuances. So you can't quite necessarily replicate, but sometimes there are things that you are able to replicate. And then, of course, always look to streamline anything and don't shy away from asset repositioning. It may be a good tool for you to maintain that affordable housing. Next slide. On the call to action, this is a sensitive topic. This will conclude soon our presentation here, so bear with me. Next slide. We have challenges and always had challenges at Housing Authority and the lack of affordable housing. So there is no doubt disinvestment can occur from businesses or taxable income that is not in the city or in a county or rural area. And when we can't find the workers that we need or those people that need to be housed, that affects us. Then local growth can stop from migration due to absence of stable housing. When we see that people in the voucher program port and in housing, in the public housing side, those are pretty much good signals. We know we need to be able to decrease the number of evictions. So what can we do to help to have tenants that would be called responsible tenants and understand that they need to keep their housing and reduce the amount of evictions? They're costly. They're associated with high dollars. Unit turnovers are not cheap. Legal costs are not cheap. What can we do to change the narrative, the discussion? And then lack of affordable housing does contribute, has a lot of negative impacts. You have already a vulnerable population out there, and inability to house creates to the safety. It does not stabilize the families. Those become challenges and increases depression and traumatic experiences for families because the lack of the basics that are being provided, which housing is one of them. It can increase the medical cost when you deal with those traumatic experiences and depression, and it always puts pressure on resources, whether that's at your authority level, at the city, county, or state level. It does create that pressure. So what can we do to change that narrative? Next slide. All right, wraparound support for success. We can engage with our local hot office, understand, we can engage with our tenants, to learn what they would like to see, listen and hear their voices. We can engage with our community leaders, go to their board meetings, civic associations, learn about that, how they can help us. For example, you don't want, it's good to have the advocates, but how can you have the advocate work with you and the tenant so you do not have to spend the dollars and the resources on legal for eviction? Use those advocates to help educate the tenant to why it's important to do certain things. Change the narrative in discussion. Be creative about that narrative on how you can turn that page and use it to your advantage to partner and have those partnerships. There's a lot of things that you can do to bring the partners together and say, okay, if we do option A, option B, option C, what are the impacts and effects of it? Hey, look, we're all working in this together. I know I say that may be simplified, but it really takes the willingness to come to the table and have conversation. And then, of course, all your local partners, your nonprofits, your philanthropists in your areas that have a need to help and support your agenda, use them and see how they're best utilized for your housing authority. Next slide. How can we increase affordable housing? We can educate, remove the stereotypes. We still are talking about it today. We need to educate even our developers. It's not all about the bottom line and earning that developer fee. We need also responsible developers that have really a stake in that investment and make meaningful contribution to the community and the city and the county. We can streamline and start with the affordable housing process. If it's not working, talk to somebody. Talk about the zoning issues, if there are any. Create those partnerships so you are able to create more project-based opportunities for you to house individuals. And then mixed income communities or mixed use developments are still very highly desired. They usually make the budget work, and then be able to afford the employee to pay a livable wage. Including the tenant, advocating on programs that afford for the tenant. So you're not going just into a workforce housing program, but advocating that even your tenants have access to livable wage jobs so they can afford rent. Next slide. All right, we are at the end. Before we ask for final questions and before I zip through, we have resources for you. Once this is posted up on HUD Exchange, like I said, everything that is underlined in blue is an active hyperlink, and everything that we discussed in this particular section would be a reading material exactly tailored to this presentation. So you got plenty of that. Save it in your favorites. Next slide. We want to remind you that all the webinar series that HUD has created, including this for occupancy series, is on HUD Exchange. So the link that you look for is PHA Occupancy Webinar Series. Next slide. Any questions and answers? Last opportunity. Additional questions can be emailed to hudcc.trainings@iem.com. In your subject line, please include PHA occupancy, TA post-training follow-up. Please include in the body of your email the name, the housing authority, the training topic, the specific issue or question, and your email and phone number so we can reach out to you. Next slide. That's it. This concludes our series on occupancy. There were a total of 8 webinars. All webinars are posted with the slides on HUD Exchange. This one will take a little time because we have to go through the audio and clean it up and make sure that we can post it, but we should be posted up through webinar 6 or even 7. And this one should be available within the next, I don't know, maybe 2 to 4 weeks as well. and you could have done many, many different things this afternoon. You chose to participate today. If you don't have any other questions, I appreciate your participation, listening to this presentation, and I hope we provided you with as much information as you wanted for your toolbox to be successful. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.